All right. Good morning, everyone. Really happy to see you on such an early morning. We enjoyed the warmth yesterday, and now it's cold again, but we hope that our conversation this morning will invigorate you and get you ready for a great weekend. So this is the first of the semester. This is our colloquium on race, equity, and justice. And this is a series that's been running for a while, and I'm really thrilled as the Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities to continue to engage with some of our brilliant scholars in the college. I'm Stephanie Shanakan, and I'm a professor of ethnomusicology, and also really think a lot about the importance of the humanities and the arts to what we're going through as a society right now. Ashley, are we recording? Just to make sure that we want to let folks know that this is being recorded, and so that we can share it with others who could not make it. So the college launched this series in 2020 as part of our broader initiative on race, equity, and justice, which was developed around the goal of using the college's expertise to better understand and more effectively dismantle racism and other forms of structural inequality. This broader initiative includes transforming our curriculum, reducing discrimination in teaching, research, and service, and expanding the impact of the college's longstanding and continuing scholarship on racism, anti-racism, equity, and justice, not just here in the United States, but all over the world. Throughout the series, the college has also worked to incorporate President Pine's focus on justice and identity, and we have welcomed students participating in the college's Terrapin Strong onboarding program. In ARHU, part of our approach to this program is to expose students to the many different ways faculty in the college study and teach about race, equity, and justice. This year, I have invited faculty from across the college to continue these important conversations. And this morning, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Paul Landau, professor in the Department of History. Paul and I had a great conversation the other day, and you're in for a treat, because he teaches classes about South Africa, political movements in West Africa, and the Atlantic world. He focuses on cinema and colonialism and mid-20th century revolutionary movements. And it is some of these topics that will inform our conversation this morning. Dr. Landau has just published his newest book, Spear, Mandela and the Revolutionaries, which examines how Nelson Mandela organized a group of revolutionary freedom fighters to openly denounce the racist apartheid regime. Together with MK, Umkhonto Wesizwe, he embarked on a dangerous but revolutionary campaign of sabotage that fueled the burgeoning global anti-apartheid struggle. In this book, Spear, Landau explores the pivotal years that led up to the Rivonia trial, in which Mandela was given a life sentence in prison, while many of his comrades were either killed, imprisoned, or exiled. And Landau's work seeks to undo some of the myths surrounding Mandela. And there are, I mean, the number of myths about Mandela are monumental. It's monumental. Our format this morning will be similar to that of past sessions. Dr. Landau will begin with a brief presentation. Then he and I will then engage in a conversation, and then we'll save some time at the end to have questions from those of you who have joined us. I'll request that you keep your microphones on mute during the presentation. Please drop your questions in the chat or send them directly to Associate Dean Patrick Warfield, who will be moderating the Q&A. When the time comes, you can also use Zoom's raise hand feature. Please note, this event is being recorded for future viewing on ARHU's website. That's my phone, so I should mute my phone. Excuse me. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Paul to give us an overview of the book and his research, and then we'll engage in a conversation. Paul, over to
Great.
you.
Thank you, Dean Shonakan. I'm going to lapse and call you Stephanie, so I insist that you continue to call me Paul.
Thank you.
Okay. Since we were on a first name basis. First of all, I'm honored to be here, seriously, in a very, very important series that I obviously am in a wholehearted support of. And I come to you as an Africanist historian who wrote mostly about the 19th century. But I wanted to write about what seemed to me to be one of the most important moments in the mid 20th century world, where there was the possibility of challenging one of the worst governments on earth, the apartheid government of South Africa, and forcing them sort of back on their heels to undo the worst of apartheid. Apartheid, as many of you know, was a system by which South Africa organized society for the benefit of white people. White people made up something like 16, 17% of the population. African people made up around 72% of the population. The rest were people of mixed descent who the government called coloreds. They organized the government, the white elected government organized society where African people couldn't live where they wanted. They couldn't send their kids to schools that they wanted them to go to. The educational curriculum was corrupted. And it made life very, very difficult, especially for the new urban people who were coming into town from the countryside around World War II. And if I can share my screen briefly, I'll just do this, and you can see, I think it should be a picture of Nelson Mandela here. And I just wanted to get you this image right here. You can see this is not everybody's image of South Africa, but this is in fact what South Africa was becoming in the 1940s and the 1950s, an urban place. And Mandela was one of the people who came into this environment and began organizing for people's rights. And that was successful in the 1950s and involved the Communist Party of South Africa, as well as the African National Congress, which he was a deputy president of. And the African National Congress was the most important African-led, African-organized movement in South Africa, and dated back to 1912. So out of this period, I realized that the government, made life impossible for these people, literally criminalizing political protest. So I recognized that there was a situation here where the people I was most interested in, Mandela and his cohort, were forced to either sort of stop or give in a certain way, or to organize in a way that was outside of legal channels. And I knew that the adoption of violence and sabotage and other means against the state was a serious decision that was taken by these people. And so in my research, I put together meticulously exactly what was going on, sort of month by month, by comparing the accounts of these people in retrospect. Many of them had given interviews with my colleagues and peers over the years from 1960, 1961, 1962. And I collected all of that material and began reconstructing what had happened in this period. And so let me back up before I say anything else about that and say that for me, what was interesting about this as an historian of the 19th century was that all of these people were still alive. Not all of them. Many of them are still alive. Many of the people whose interviews that I used were still alive. I had interviewed many of them. And so I was writing about people who could rebuke me if I made a mistake. And I was very aware that this was a huge responsibility to try to get things right, even if I would ultimately fail. And so unlike all of the other projects that I had done, I was kind of, dealing with real people with real lives who wouldn't necessarily agree with my account of them in many cases, the people who had survived. So Stephanie, I mean, I guess to wind that part of it up, I was attracted to do this. It was a different kind of a project from my previous ones. I felt I was really positioned to be able to do it. I affiliated with the University of Johannesburg, worked with a young graduate student there, Wendell Moray. I looked at, with permission, dozens of archives, and I wanted to recover this forgotten memory, this sort of lapsed memory. In South Africa, it was very important to see everything as gearing toward the end of apartheid during the struggle. One never wanted to say, oh, look at this terrible defeat that we suffered, for instance. And what I found was that that led to a sort of hole in which exactly what Mandela had tried to do had been forgotten. And the other people around him, the hundreds of people, some in the Pan-Africanist Congress, not allied to him at all. And so some of these people were friends, colleagues in law. They, all of them, were involved in violent activity, in destruction of property, in ways that challenged them and stressed them out. They were most often civilians and law-abiding people. And I wanted to recover that. I wanted to say, okay, so what did that mean? Why was this decision taken? Who participated in it? How was it organized? What were their plans? And that's how I proceeded.
Thank you, Paul. I mean, just as I was driving in this morning, I was thinking about again, I think at this point I'm a scratched record. I talk a lot about the importance of the humanities, because as I was driving in this morning, there was of course, coverage of what's going on in Ukraine. And there were references back to the 1930s, what was going on in Europe in the 1930s. And what I think is so incredible about your work is that you're doing the same thing, is that you are taking us back to a point in African history, really, which is world history, where a group of revolutionaries said, down with tyranny, right? Let's figure out some alternative routes to justice. And so your book is very much it's a retelling of the story, or it's a telling of the story in a different way.
Yeah,
Because,
and
right?
if I could just say it exactly, it's a telling of this. First of all, it's a telling of a story that is new in important ways. One of the things I'm trying to sort of get is there's not one story, there's not the story that I'm telling that in fact, there's new conclusions that can be come to if one pays attention to sources. But there's some sense in what you're saying beyond that. I want to just be contrary, because in fact, I am telling the story of what these people are going through from the point of view of those people at the time. I'm attempting to live within the moment of being at the edge of revolutionary activity among Mandela and his colleagues, Sisulu, Kotane, Motsoaledi, Flagbush, Yellow, others who have sort of dropped out of the historical record, as well as Indra's Naidu, Yusuf Kachalia, Bram Fisher, Ruth First, Ruth Motswati. So there are many people who are in this book who I'm recovering as part of this firmament of we're in action. We're being chased by the government. Many of us are going underground. What are we attempting to do? And I wanted to stay in that moment and recover the hope and possibility of transformation.
Mhm.
And just to finish this one thought, the reason I wanted to do that is because I think it's important to do now, because in the early 1990s, the culmination of the whole narrative of the struggle was justifiably the end of apartheid.
That's right.
I mean, it's a huge, significant change.
Mm.
Mandela became president of the country. The huge, significant things, right?
Mhm.
But unfortunately, as we go on in the decades, in 2023, and certainly I'm going to soft sell this compared to what my South African colleagues would tell you.
Mhm.
Um, the promise has not been fulfilled. It's not just a matter of services not being delivered and so on. It's a matter of a huge gulf between rich and poor.
Mhm.
It's a matter of people still living in circumstances that they shouldn't be living in, where catastrophic fires can take out whole neighborhoods in a minute because the shacks are built so closely together, where crime and criminality is a constant concern, especially for young women.
Mhm.
This is can't be ignored, that the the promise of a
Mhm.
post-apartheid society has not been completely
Yes.
fulfilled. And
Mhm.
so to say, okay, so why am I saying that? I'm saying that because that's why I think
Mhm.
it's a good time to look back,
Yeah.
to say, at the time, what were these people thinking
Mhm.
they were trying to do? What
Mhm.
was their vision?
Mhm.
Because it was stopped with great brutality by
Mhm.
the apartheid state,
That's
by
right.
torture, by detention for 3-month periods that were renewable without
Mhm.
uh, uh, any kind of court appointment and so on. So these were, once the movement was destroyed in the country, there was a period of stock taking. This is seen as catastrophic by
Mhm.
most of these people, and they really thought that a disaster had descended
Mhm.
on.
Mhm.
And the attempt to continue resistance with the African National Congress and Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, abroad, based abroad as a kind of a foreign-based movement, succeeded because of the anti-apartheid movement worldwide and so on. But we shouldn't be deluded. I mean, a mere score of people in offices and so on abroad is not the same as a movement that had 100,000 people, perhaps, as members of the African National Congress. We don't know, thousands and thousands more at a moment where it was potentially possible to have a kind of mass movement that would transform society. So this is a defeat and a catastrophe, but there's a reason to look back at things that have been forgotten because they were defeats and catastrophes now,
Mhm.
when we're freshly thinking about what can be done then to
That's right.
make
Mhm.
South Africa and to make this country,
Mhm.
to make your point about a sort of transference of ideas here to the humanities in general. You know, this is a contribution based on the idea that individual people can, by really carefully looking at the record, keeping an open mind,
Mhm.
fully informed of what other scholars are doing, you know, make a difference, that people
That's
will
right.
look
Mhm.
at their own society differently. That
That's
can be done for myths and narratives that have served a purpose in this country, but perhaps aren't serving the same purpose, or perhaps people are having doubts about them.
mm.
I think that's for Americanists to think about, but that would be one way
Yeah.
it's applicable.
Mhm. Thank you, Paul. I mean, everything you just said is reverberating for me because we are right now on the eve of Nigeria is going back to the polls tomorrow. And there's been so much tension because, again, of the history, you know, as the candidates are making their last plea for votes, there's so much talk about what happened in the past, who do these candidates represent, who are the people behind them, and what will happen in the future. You're very right that in the 1990s, we jumped straight from Mandela at Robben Island to Mandela as president without thinking about what happened before Robben Island, right? And what happened after, and certainly what has happened since the 1990s to now. One of the, and I love that you reference the United States as well, because what we've learned here is that freedom doesn't just appear, right? It's not a revolution of the 1960s. We have desegregation and then we're all okay. There's so much of the sort of the rootedness of supremacy, of injustice, that it takes so many years to unravel that. And I think what we're seeing in South Africa might be similar, although not parallel, because the demographics are so different. The history is so different as well. Paul, can I want to go back to the notion of revolution and how you describe it in the book. And so I'm going to just read a little bit of one of the paragraphs. You say, we quote, "We will take revolution to mean a thoroughgoing and rapid reversal, or preferably destruction, of those hierarchies determining unequal access to life's opportunities." Right? That's a great definition of revolution. Can you, of course, you talk more about it in the book, but can you talk more about how revolution and how MK approached the notion of revolution? Because Mandela was a lawyer, there was a lot of diplomacy and a lot of different approaches, but your focus in this book is one particular part of the revolution.
Thank you. Yes, Stephanie, in the middle of the century, it was a period of anti-colonial movements, for starters. And you mentioned Nigeria. This is the period of the Zikists and parallel things going on in Zimbabwe with sabotage. And there, the issue was throwing off white colonial domination, throwing off imperialism. And so that's revolutionary in one sense. And the Philippines, China, the struggle even against the British occupation in Israel, Palestine, by Israeli Jewish terrorists, the Irgun. This was a major influence on Mandela and the people around him as well, because they were looking for parallels by which they could understand their own situation, as they thought it was moving in the same direction, at least eliminating white colonial prerogatives. Algeria stood as a kind of huge object lesson that was unfolding at the time, that Mandela paid close attention to. He visited Morocco and met with Algerian commanders in 1962. It was a bit scary because, the idea of a sort of Algerian solution wasn't really that attractive once warfare had spread to theaters and cafes and so on. So, but nonetheless, this was a moment of accord when he was in Morocco, and the Evian Accords. So they thought, okay, we've succeeded. And so he drew the conclusion not that this was one way to go, to use actions that would destroy property, at least. I don't think Mandela ever decided, yes, we're going to murder people, but that was an influence. Let me just say, though, that a big influence was that Mandela himself joined the Communist Party in 1955, was an active member of the party in every sense, in that he understood the ideas of the party. He favored the idea of a people's revolution in the countryside, and in the cities. He read Mao and Chinese communists very carefully. And he couldn't imagine that things were going to stop with getting rid of racial laws only. At that point, he was a total red, as Winnie Mandela described him. And so he's similar to many other mid-century um, African Caribbean and African American leaders who came to some of the same conclusions about things, but often did not move toward a military force. They couldn't, and most often left the Communist Party. And so Mandela, like others around him, like Walter Sisulu and his close collaborators, Duma Nokwe, and even Oliver Tambo would have joined the party most likely if asked. These people were possessed of the understanding that the changes they needed to make in South Africa were drastic, would be more than just getting rid of the laws that had been passed that differentiated between Black people and white people, which was one of them. So in that sense, he was a revolutionary. Whether that was correct or not, I leave to others, but I do believe that that's fair. And the attempt to make revolution was modeled in part on other vanguards like the ones that I mentioned.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
he has importance looking back and thinking about his words more generally, but the truth is that he shifted in prison.
Mm-hmm.
And once he was in prison, there was still an effort to have a wide-scale mass violent uprising called Operation Maibuye, which followed a PAC operation that involved arming people and having people attack white people in the street for 4 hours on April 8th, 1963. The plan was for. So to be honest, to recreate that environment, this is a situation where guerrilla movements were not only being contemplated, but were in train. Anti-personnel weapons were being developed, mines, grenades by MK in a hurry. They were trying to get a lot of explosives, and it was not an unserious effort, although it was a desperate effort to raise a kind of insurgent rebellion.
Right.
It was crushed.
Yeah.
The operation was stopped in its tracks, and everybody was put into prison.
Yeah. I think there's so many things I want to ask you, but let me go here. What I appreciate about the way you write this book is the beginning, because the beginning of the book, chapter 1, Crisis, is the title of that chapter, sets the scene for why the revolutionaries did what they did. I don't know that there's another book by a historian, like a serious historian like yourself, that begins with the sound of guns, right?
Yeah, I know what you're referring to, Stephanie.
Yeah, I think it's so
Let me
powerful.
explain that.
Please.
For those who don't know what's being alluded to, Glenn Frankel and another historian put together a meticulous account of exactly who fired guns and in what order at this particular Sharpeville situation. This was a situation that the PAC organized people to travel without their passbooks, and then this became to bring their passbooks to police stations, which was not the original idea. And the presentation of these passbooks to police stations was something that was supposed to be all over the country, but it took place really only because of lack of communication in a few places, and one was in Sharpeville, which was a sort of a new community in the Witwatersrand area, the area of gold mining, designed for Black people to live in. And people approached the wire for the local police station, and the police panicked. They had brought in extra ammunition and extra police from outside the area who didn't even know, didn't know anything about how to interact with the local people, and they killed 69 people and wounded many others, some of whom most likely died from their wounds.
Mhm.
Um, and this is the gunfire that
Mhm.
Stephanie's alluding to. They shot most of these people in the back as they ran away, and this became a sort of international
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
issue right away. And what it did is the government then criminalized the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress
Mhm.
under Robert Sobukwe, um, made it impossible to organize on the streets or assemble or discuss politics and so on. There were already laws of that nature, but now they were enforced. So that's what the transition was.
Mhm.
Everybody kind of, you know, had to face what was going on at that point.
Right. Right. And Paul, for those of you of our audience that don't understand or don't have never heard of passbooks, can you just talk a little bit about what
Sure,
what the regime of apartheid was? Like what is it
sure.
that Mandela and his and Sisulu and Tambo, what were they, what was the system? What were the elements of the system that they were fighting against, like passbooks?
So ironically, none of those three people who you mentioned, certainly not Dumanokwe and not Mandela, had to carry a passbook
Mhm.
because they were exempt, being
Right.
professionals, which is interesting to
It is.
note.
Mhm.
But all of those people in the picture that I showed you earlier would have had to carry passbooks, and every single worker and every domestic worker and everyone, and women included, after 1955. So what this meant was that the government was attempting to control the movements of the population in order to put cheap labor where they wanted to put it, in order to keep people living where they wanted to have them live. They had no way to computerize this. So this was simply enforced on the ground. So you physically had to carry a booklet stamped by your employer and by the labor bureau assigning you your job and so on, and have it on your person. And any policeman, a 19-year-old white cop, could stop you and interrogate you and scrutinize your passbook to make sure it was in order. And in this way, the government sent hundreds of thousands of people out of the cities. Their passbooks were not in order because they were looking for work, for instance, right? And didn't have them in order yet. Um, and sent them back to rural areas. So there was this constant movement of people. Um, this is because business and the government cooperated intimately in South Africa. There's no real difference between civil and criminal law in South Africa. So you had masters and servants laws and other kinds of laws passed where essentially contracts that Black people would make would be enforced by the police. So it wasn't about suing somebody. There was none of that. So what this meant was that um, your life chances in that world were severely constrained as a Black person. And in order even to get a secondary school education, to do the equivalent of high school, you had to be both fortunate, wealthy, comparatively speaking. There was, of course, wealth among Black people as well as white people. It was unusual. And you most likely had to have connections, and so probably had to be highborn in some way to some sort of chiefly aristocracy. All that was true for Mandela, all of those things. Um, and he, like some others, managed to go to there. I'm exaggerating a little. For secondary school, there were ways to go to secondary school if you were exceedingly bright and so on and so forth, but it was very unusual. But Mandela even did the equivalent of going to college and getting a law degree, and that kind of thing was, stratospherically unusual. He wasn't the first. It wasn't the first Black law firm, by the way. Uh, there were several other all
Mhm.
Black law firms before Mandela and Tambo's law firm, but several other, what are we counting, in between 10 and 15 maybe. So this is a country of millions of people. So this is not a normal
Mhm.
trajectory to be on. I don't know what led me to that, but it's significant. And Glolela Mungu is writing a biography of Mandela because it's important to note that he did have this leadership background from who he was, in a sense,
Mhm.
in his own in the Eastern Cape and the rural domain that he came from. And Glorilla will write about this more, but his background was wrapped up with British and Cape administration.
Mhm.
It was a part of South Africa's history, let us put it that way,
Yeah.
in very interesting ways, his own family.
Mhm. I mean, Paul, again, I could go in any direction based on what you just said. You know, I'm thinking about just earlier this week we had Dionne Warwick on campus, and we talked about what it was like for her to live in the United States and to tour in the South in the 1950s and 60s. And she talks about the fact that they couldn't go into certain areas and so on. So right now I'm buzzing with the ways in which your work really reach across to meet us where we are right now. I'm thinking about gentrification right now, you know, where people can live, you know, all the redlining, all of that. So you
The
know,
the connection is real, and
real.
redlining, as you know, and also from my colleague David Freud's work, is
Mhm,
Freud has written about this in great detail. But the inability for large sections of this country to husband wealth
mhm,
has been a very significant
right,
comparable issue for South Africa. And so even though apartheid, I think apartheid is distinguished in that you actually have forums going to people saying, you can't live here because you're not white. This is a whites only area. That what's the shock of South Africa is that as the rest of the world kind of moved toward some civil rights movement, some kind of, there was real change in this country in the 50s and 60s for the good, right? That's not what happened in South Africa.
mhm,
Instead, there's a complete sort of entrenchment by the government where they stop those movements
mhm,
in their tracks, arrest all of those people. And it's at that point that revolutionary sentiment almost crystallizes because
mhm,
people are saying, and they're assisted, by the way, just let me say, by vets who've come back from the war
mhm,
and joined socialist groups. You know, they no white guys. They don't want to fight for a fascist government when they've just been fighting against the Nazis. They can't believe that they have to come back and be a good citizen in a country that's a hair's breadth away from Nazism itself.
mhm,
So this contributes to the idea. These people are familiar with war. This
mhm.
contributes to the idea that, well, yeah, we can organize something here too.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I think so interesting. I think some may also, I agree that there were mountains were moved in the 1960s here in the United States, but there was still ground that needed at that time, and even still now to be made towards
Sure.
justice, right? But definitely similar stories, but very different outcomes in many ways. I know that I'm looking at our time. I have so many questions, but I want to step back and ask you, Paul, about how you became an Africanist. And I think it's important for, you know, when students watch this to understand the journey of a historian like yourself. I know that you speak Zulu and other languages. How did you get to become an Africanist, and how did language, your knowledge of the cultures, the language, how did that help you to get to a point where you could put out an exceptional book on the history of South Africa?
Well, thank you very much. I guess I would say I'm a New Yorker, born and bred in the Upper West Side, grew up in the 1970s with all of the sort of craziness that might imply. Changing neighborhoods, gangs at the corner, but also a sense of this is the center of the world. I'm where it's all happening. Um, and race and racial strife was apparent as a big issue in the world around me,
Mhm.
on the street. And when I got to college, I was interested in American history and the history that would explain that, but also got interested in the history of South Africa and wrote about South Africa for my BA and did original research. And the sort of bug bit me that, wow, you can read people's memoirs and letters and you can come to original, conclusions that are defensible about
Mhm.
things.
Mhm.
That was exciting. And I went to graduate school and focused on Africa. We had to relinquish a lot of what we thought we were going to do when we went to graduate school, which is something I think is still a function of graduate school, less so today than it could be.
Mm.
But that you realize that there's a world of knowledge with its own structures that
That's right.
you haven't had access to. And with me, I was in a program that was the dominant program of the late 20th century.
University of Wisconsin.
Yes,
Mm.
Madison, Wisconsin, and Jan Van Sina, Stephen Fireman, Bill Brown, and others taught me. Dan Guneni taught me Zulu, as you mentioned. I went and did a summer of Setswana, where I really learned more Setswana than I learned Zulu. I learned Zulu grammatically, but I
Mm.
learned more to speak Setswana. And Jennifer Yanko and Tembum Gadla taught me. Gadla's, I believe, the head of department at the University of Botswana now in the history department. Um, and so I did my field research on African people in Botswana, a kingdom that used Christianity to establish its power and maintain its power against the British imperial authorities,
Mhm.
under their noses, so to speak. And I wrote another book going back to the 1400s and trying to recover indigenous political traditions based on archaeology and linguistics and oral traditions in South Africa and Southern Africa. Um, After that, so my original idea for myself was that I wanted to write 19th century and earlier history. But to come back to your original question, I wanted to resolve the problem of why it was that there was so much hatred and antipathy
Mhm.
around race.
Mhm.
I mean, in a sense, that was still something that troubled me and that also sort of prickled at me ego-wise. Like I thought, this has sort of mastered you, Paul. You want to master this. See if you can understand this and get behind it.
Mhm.
Um, so I've tried to do that for what it's worth, in the hopes that ultimately we can have a truly non-racial future.
Mhm.
So.
And so we're going to turn it over to other questions, even though I have so many more. But we definitely want to save time for those who've joined us to ask questions. What I do appreciate about this, I think we're so lucky to have you here at the University of Maryland, because you model the careful attention to research that will result in finding answers to the big questions that we're asking, right? Too often now we jump on Twitter, we think we know it all, and we think we have an answer. But what you've done is that you've studied the language, you've lived in Southern Africa, you have written books that brought you to this point, right? You focus on the 19th century, you've moved into the 20th century. And I think, and you and I talked about this book as a sort of emancipatory project, right? And we can't really understand emancipation without doing the work to see what it looked like and see the different approaches. So just really, really grateful that you're a colleague, or that I've become a colleague here, because you've been here a lot longer than I have, Paul.
Thank you very much, and we're very fortunate to have you. However,
Oh, thank you.
I hope you
Thank
stay for a long time.
you. As long as you have. And so we need to collaborate on something. You know, for me, South Africa and apartheid, I came to it through Miriam Makeba and Hugh Masekela, as someone who studies music, and of course poetry, you know, and literature. You know, all of these fields have informed what we now know about that country. So and that region generally. Okay, so I'm going to see if Patrick, I'm going to open it to questions through, and Patrick will help field these. Patrick.
Well, I see we have one raised hand. So Ahmed, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I can't start my video, so that's fine. I've been enjoying this exceptionally rich conversation. Thank you, Paul and Stephanie. And of course, I'm delighted that Paul and his book is getting this kind of attention. But Stephanie, you just mentioned an emancipatory project. And my question to Paul was, can you talk, Paul, a bit about how your book is being received in South Africa today? What's the impact it's having? And just anything you can say about this. Obviously, it's pretty fresh, but it has already generated quite a lot of, received quite a lot of attention. I know that both in South Africa itself and elsewhere in Africa, and also in this country in Europe. So.
Thank you. I hope you're correct. I've seen the very beginnings of attention to it, so it's difficult to say. But I can answer the question of how it's received, because I've had conversations with some colleagues in launching the book, and I know some colleagues have read it and have paid attention to it. Among fellow historians, I've been totally knocked out. I mean, it's been very well received among fellow historians, and I don't want to say I'm humble, but I'm left speechless by some of what people have said. Among the public, it's less easy to internalize to an existing need or narrative because it doesn't lend itself to the sides that have formed in South Africa on some of these issues. For instance, the issue of whether Mandela was a communist or not is actually an issue of, it's just camouflage. It's an issue of whether white people were in control of the revolutionary movement behind the scenes, because in South Africa, the people who are debating this persist in seeing the Communist Party at that point as it was not, as a sort of white working class party. And so the question doesn't even make sense. So they look at the book and don't know whether they recognize it as sort of pro-communist or at least pro-structural change in South Africa. And I've had somebody accuse me of not paying attention to the evils of Stalinism in the book. And then you have other people who knew Mandela or people around him, many of whom are elderly people now, but who I've heard from a couple who say, you know, this is nonsense. He was not a communist at all. He was a man of peace. I knew him quite well. Mr. Landau is simply mistaken. So the thesis of the book, based on the idea of reconstructing who he was when he was 41, 42 years old, is just wiped away as an error. And there's a reason for a lot of South Africans who are in the book to want to see this book as nothing. It's because it implicates them not just as heroes, which they are shown in many ways in this book, but it also implicates them in other uncomfortable ways that they would rather not talk about, that somebody is cited giving up a name that led to their arrest. I know this is an issue with a couple of people in this book. just to take a for instance, that they concealed Mandela's party affiliation or minimized it or said on a technicality it wasn't real for decades. Why would they do that? They don't want to answer that question. And so they don't have to. I'm not important enough, you know, to if I were writing and I was maybe, Paulo Jordan writing or Mark Gavisser writing or, a political person, a prominent journalist. But so far, I think there's this sort of hands-off attitude. One more example, the connection that was sought out by MK to have Israeli Mossad come and train their people, not unrelated to the fact that Mandela's trainers in Ethiopia had just come back from Tel Aviv, where they had been trained by Mossad for a year. This is something that almost immediately in the 60s became an unpopular kind of affiliation, and the sympathy with the Palestinian struggle became the dominant sort of association for the ANC. They trained with PLO guys in Titero in East Germany militarily, so they had connections there. But it doesn't matter. The truth is the connection to Israel was at least maintained on a low boil throughout the 1970s, in my view, by the African National Congress, certainly past 1975. So that kind of thing has caused comment because that sort of stirs the pot of what African National Congress policy is now. But to really, it was on the front page of the Mail and Guardian in the review, and the reviewer could have savaged the book and didn't. I mean, I don't think they came from the same place I was, but the reviewer, who I know now, and is a really interesting person, Huey Orlean, basically said, no, it's largely successful in recasting Mandela as a sort of sympathetic figure, putting it that way because Mandela had been criticized heavily in South African elite circles for giving away too much in the 1990s and so on. And so he says, no, the heroic, principled guerrilla leader does come through here, and
That's
so
good.
it's gotten positive reviews in some ways, but otherwise silence, Ahmed.
Thank you.
Invite other questions either in the chat or through raised hands. And I was wondering, Paul, could you spin that out a little bit further? I'm curious about undergraduates who probably, and I know I get most of my view of Mandela through popular culture, movies, and music. And I'm sure many undergraduates probably have a kind of one-dimensional view of Mandela. Can you talk a little bit about how you help them see him in a more complex way?
Sure. Well, I think that let's just take, there's another study to be done, the complex person that is Nelson Mandela. And I think that would be an interesting study, and it would take into account his thinking and his transformation while he was in prison for 27 years. I think that what I'm doing is I'm as a brief snapshot of a guy who's a divorcee, who's having difficulties in his marriage and then gets divorced, who's a boxer who funds a gym, who boxes on weekends, who's an internationalist who goes out of his way to make friends with people of different walks of life, different religious persuasions. He belongs to an international club, who is a lawyer who, I don't talk about this, but this has been caricatured. The bizarre truth of the South African legal system is that Mandela was permitted to interrogate white witnesses in trials. He was a lawyer. There was no, so the gallery had to stand around in apartheid South Africa while Nelson Mandela showed his legal chops in confusing and belittling the memories of white witnesses to crimes. That was exciting for people. So he drove a nice car. He had his suits tailored by the same tailor who did the state president. This was not a guy who was not aware of what it meant to be a sort of prominent person and be recognized, and so on. And yet, I think, like many of the other leaders around him, his goals were to bring African people into collective autonomous power again. The African people had been in power. African people must lead any movement. And unlike many of his colleagues, including his black colleague Flag-Bush Yellow, who argued with him about this, Mandela felt that black people had to be the center and front and leadership of the movement in South Africa. That's an important element too for him. But he, with others, felt that this only could be accomplished with the Communist Party and with the ideals of communism, meaning that workers and farmers, how could he not feel that? If you go to rural South Africa and you see the way this historic land that belonged to African people is under cultivation with white landlords, allowing the black families to live in small little sections of it, cordoned off, while the landlord gets all of the produce and pays them a wage and so on, which is really a poor wage, because there's no open negotiations possible in their system. It didn't seem possible that you could just say, okay, we'll change the laws of apartheid, but we'll keep that situation forever.
Yeah. Paul, we have 3 more minutes, and I wonder if you could bless us by showing us the board that,
all right.
that led to the book, because I think it's important to, as you're bringing it up, I think it's important to recognize the amount of work it took to bring this complexity that Patrick has just asked you about, right? So.
Oh, sorry, I have to go to the correct one. Just give me 1 second. I'm about to successfully do it now. Hopefully.
So for those of you who are here, I had asked, so this is the 2018 one. Okay.
I know I'm literally on it, but it's not able to do it.
Okay.
Wait, hold shift to select multiple windows. I don't want to select multiple windows.
All right, we see the commuters again.
I'm sorry for that.
No,
This is my book. There is my other book. I'm going to give it one more shot. Just let me see if I can do it one more time. Just let me close this now entirely, so it won't be there, and there'll only be one possible image to share. In 5 seconds, we should have it.
Okay.
Do we have it here?
We have the 2018 board of, there we go. Yes, we see it. We see it.
So you can see a version now of my office. Stephanie wanted me to, this is simply the 1961 wall. I had a 1960, 61, 62, and 63 wall, and they had snippets of these interviews attached to each other and pasted to the wall around my office. So I couldn't get to my books for quite a while.
I love it. And why I think that image is important is that it's important for us to realize, even as we think of what the critics have said about the book, or what Patrick has just asked you, that you did not take this mission lightly, that you spent a lot of time and paid particular attention to every aspect. And that small glimpse is something that we need to be reminded of as we consider.
Tiffany, it almost killed me. Do you know the Gospel of St. Thomas supposedly has a line that says, if you bring forth what is within you, it will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, it will kill you. Oh, so well, that was the 2 options there. Yeah.
Well, you brought it forth. You sure did. Paul, thank you very much. You know, as I mentioned to you, we in the college are thinking about what leadership means through the humanities, and you have exemplified a leader who you have presented to us in a way that really highlights the importance of the humanities. So I wanted to say thank you. Thank you to Patrick and Ashley Richardson Miller, who do an incredible job of curating these
Thank you, guys.
conversations. And Paul, glad it didn't kill you. Glad that you're a colleague, and for all of you here, thank you very much for coming. We will have another one soon. Ashley, do we have a date for our next Race, Equity, and Justice series?
I'll get back to you. I believe it's in April.
Okay, great. So
Thank you, Stephanie. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Paul. Have a good rest of the day, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.